Hey everyone, Sam here, thanks for joining me. In this video I'm going to show you how to paint a landscape that features trees, vegetation and water, and I'm going to give you some specific tips for painting tree trunks and foliage. Now the painting I'm going to show you I did about a couple of months ago, and it started off as a plein air painting and then I took it back to the studio and added more detail to it. So the first half of the video is of me outdoors painting on plein air, and at the time when I painted it I hadn't actually painted outdoors in quite a while. Obviously if you've been watching my channel you'll see that I've done more plein air painting since then, which I've also added detail to in the studio. So the first half of the video is me painting outdoors, and then the second half is me adding detail to this painting in the studio. Now if you like this video be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. So I hope you enjoyed this video, let's roll the tape. Alright, so I've just arrived at a place called Phthalo Hill, which is in my local area in the village of Opua in the Bay of Islands in northern New Zealand. And I think it's quite a good day for painting. It is a bit windy and blustery as we had a lot of rain yesterday, but these days are always good because you get lots of light effects and atmosphere. So I'm going to set up my gear and start painting. In this particular area there's loads of estuaries and hillsides with awesome views and lots of native trees, so I just wanted to capture the atmosphere of the area. So this view I'm painting is from a place called Phthalo Hill, where you can see the Waikari Inlet in the midground there, that body of water. Now it was a bit of a windy day, but still not bad conditions for painting, and some awesome light as well, as there was intermittent cloud. Right, so I've got my gear set up and I'm painting on an 8x10 linen panel, and I'm just about to sketch out my composition. So I'm starting off with some burnt sienna and I'm mixing it in with liquin, and liquin is the medium I'm going to be using. It's an alkyd resin. It speeds up the drying time as I'm using oil paint, and it also improves the flow of the paint, so it's really good for plein air painting. Using a number 1 round brush and just with burnt sienna, and I'm going to start just roughly sketching the outline of the composition. So this gum tree, which is one of the main parts of the composition here, so starting off by sketching out the stem, some of these branches, and a bit of mark out where some of the foliage is going to go. Now although you can see the road and the building down the bottom, I've decided that I'm going to actually eliminate it from the composition because I don't think it's going to really do much. And this composition is going to be loosely based on a steel yard composition. So we've got the large element here, the tree, the gum tree, and then the pine trees here in the distance. Right, now the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to paint the dark values first, because in that way I can quickly establish a tonality in the painting, and it's just going to make it much easier for me to add the areas that are in light afterwards. So first of all I'm going to start with those shadows in the distant trees there, and I'm just mixing up ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna and titanium white to start with. I'll probably add more colour to it a bit later on, but to start with I'm just going to keep it simple. Because the other thing is I want to make the landforms in the distance look like they're quite far away. It's quite a hazy day today. We had a lot of rain yesterday, so now the sun's come out. Right, next I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the main stem in of this gum tree, just because again I'm going to keep the colours simple, so I'm still using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna with a little titanium white. And next I'm going to start painting these pine tree shadows. They're quite a lot darker in value, and this is just a mix of ultramarine blue and yellow oxide. And that just creates a nice dark tone. Right, next I'm going to paint the sky. It's quite light at the moment because of the full sun. So I'm just starting off with a simple mix of ultramarine blue and titanium white. And I might add a bit of yellow oxide in there. And I'm going to leave a few gaps for the tree foliage as well. Okay, just in case the sun disappears, I think I'm going to get straight onto the water. So I'm going to continue to use my sky mix, ultramarine blue and titanium white, and I'm just going to mix in a little yellow oxide. See how we get on there. There we go. Right, I'm going to paint the fields in the distance. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a mix of cobalt, teal and yellow oxide, and I'm even just going to round it off a bit with a little Quinacridone magenta. I've got to keep this colour quite desaturated. Right, I'm going to mix up the foliage for the pine trees, and I'm going to carry on using this ultramarine blue and yellow oxide. I think then what I'm going to do is mix in a bit of cobalt teal. Now there's lots of different shades of green here, so I'm just adding colour as I go along. So I've now just mixed in some Quinacridone magenta and just adding some of the plants here with some of these, some more paler greens. Now it's my intention to add more detail to this in the studio, so I'm just getting in my colours and values and just information that I can use for when I add more detail to this in the studio. I'm just going to start painting in some of the gum tree foliage here. This is ultramarine blue, yellow oxide and cobalt teal. And next I'm just going to paint the tops of these carnuka trees, and this is a mix of ultramarine blue, yellow oxide and burnt sienna. So these are a much more brownish olivey green. So I'm just filling in some negative spaces around these carnuka trees here, because I'm going to come back and restate the darks and go over the whole painting in general. Okay, now I'm going to start restating some of these dark tones within the trees. Mix of ultramarine blue and yellow oxide. Now next I'm going to make a much more rich green for the foreground, so I'm going to start off with some cadmium yellow and some ultramarine blue. I'm going to round it off with some cadmium orange. Let's just see, oh, that's way too bright. Okay, so I'm going to mix in some titanium white into that because it's a bit too saturated. And what I'm going to do also is mix in a little bit of phthalo green, just to green it up a bit more. Ultimately I'm going to be able to sort all of this out in the studio, but right, now I'm going to do some more work on this tree. and paint the stem, which is in shadow. And the bark is relatively light, but it's in quite a sharp shadow, so it's a kind of dark to mid-tone. So I'm just starting off with ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and titanium white. But I'm most definitely going to be adding some highlights to this shortly. And I'm just going to start painting some highlights on this, and I'm just going to mix titanium white with burnt sienna. And I think I'll add a little bit of yellow oxide in there too. I actually think I might add a bit of cobalt teal into this mix as well. Some nice turquoise tones in the water. So I'm just going back over the sky again, and the light's changed and I can now see some different colours in the sky. So I started off with ultramarine blue and titanium white, but I've now decided to add a bit of cobalt teal into the mix because there's a little bit of a kind of green element in the sky. So I'm going to use this and I'm going to paint the negative spaces around the leaves of these trees as well. Okay, now I'm just going to go back over the gum tree and just paint some lighter areas in the foliage. So again, ultramarine blue, yellow oxide and a bit of cobalt teal. Right, so there's my painting so far. Done about as much as I can at the moment, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it back to the studio, let it dry, and then I'm going to start painting some detail on it. Now the other things such as the boats and other small details, I'll be adding that later on in the studio. So I've had a really enjoyable morning painting outdoors. It's been the first time in ages that I've painted outdoors on plein air, probably about 3 months, so it's just really nice to be out in the sunshine. I've got my painting finished, or at least as much as I can. I'm going to take it back to the studio, let it dry, and then I'm going to start adding some detail to it. Okay, so back in the studio now. I've been really enjoying painting on plein air recently. I just love being outdoors, and I always find it much easier to capture the true atmosphere, the tonal dynamic and depth, and the colours and values. It also gets me out of the studio as well, which is really good. I just love being outside in the fresh air and just having the warm sunlight on my skin. Absolutely love it. Now, I probably could have definitely left this painting as it is, as just a loose gestural plein air painting, but I really wanted to add some detail to it. So what I've done here is I've gone back over the sky and just refined that a little more. And I'm pretty much using the same colours that I was using when I was painting out in the field. I just readjust the value of those shadows on the distant hills. And it's the same colours I was using before, a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna and some titanium white. And I just reinforce those shadows. One thing I've noticed about the greens of the grass in this part of New Zealand is they're really vibrant, and I don't know whether it's because we're kind of bordering on the subtropics here, but they seem to be this almost electric green. However, I've still got to make that sit back in the painting, otherwise it will leap forward and I'll lose that depth. So what I've been doing here is mixing ultramarine blue with yellow oxide, titanium white to make the value lighter and to desaturate the colour, but then also mixing in a little cobalt teal, which is a kind of turquoise green blue. It's a really nice colour to have on your palette. So I do some more work on these fields and the distant trees. And then the next major area that I work on in this painting is restating those shadows that are in the pine trees and the plants in the foreground. There's a whole mixed bag of plants here. We've got Monterey pine, which is from the USA, and then a load of native trees including carnuka, which is very common around here. Also tortora as well, and then we've got a gum tree in the foreground, which is from Australia. So I've painted the shadows again in the pine trees, which is a mix of ultramarine blue and yellow oxide. And then I'm going to paint the areas of foliage that's in light. Now pine is a generally kind of darker green, so for this I've mixed yellow oxide with some ultramarine blue and then a little bit of cadmium yellow just to increase the saturation, and I've also rounded it off with a small amount of burnt sienna. And I'm painting the foliage with a number 3 filbert brush, as that rounded edge is really great for painting foliage. I paint the grass in the midground with more of a low chroma green, and what I've done here is I've taken my pine tree mix but added in some more yellow oxide and titanium white, and also rounded it off with some burnt sienna. Next I work on the main trunk of the gum tree. Now there are lots of species of gum trees, but many of them have relatively light coloured bark that's often a creamy white colour, and this particular gum tree definitely exhibits those lighter colours. The tree is also 3/4 in shadow, so how do we create a realistic looking tree trunk? Well, the fact that it's 3/4 in shadow is going to help massively. The first thing I do is establish a dark line in the transition zone between the area that's in full sunlight and the rest of the trunk that's in shadow. For this I create a dark tone of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna. And then I paint the rest of the bark that's in shadow with a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, yellow oxide and titanium white. I vary up the mixture a little bit by adding in more burnt sienna or more yellow oxide here and there. And the burnt sienna and yellow oxide helps to create warm reflected light in that shadow. By the way, although I mainly use yellow oxide, you can also use yellow ochre. The two colours are very similar. Yellow oxide is a tiny bit punchier, but it's also cheaper as well. I paint the highlights of the tree trunk with a mix of titanium white with some burnt sienna and yellow oxide. At this stage of the painting, once I'd finished working on the gum tree, I needed to allow the whole thing to dry so that I could start adding more detail. Next I work on the form of the pine tree, and what I've done here is I've used the same colours in the water to create gaps in the pine tree and define the shape of the tree by filling in negative spaces around it. Then once this is done, I then need to restate the shadows again and add more areas to the pine tree's crown that's in the full sunlight. I work on that gum tree foliage again, and I'm now using a number 1 round brush and start painting the suggestion of individual leaves. At this point in the painting, it was dry enough that I could really start working on the finer detail within the pine tree. And for this I'm using a number 0 synthetic round brush which has got a nice fine point. And I use this to paint the suggestion of clumps of pine needles. Now again, I'm using the same colours that I was using earlier, but then I've also introduced a little bit of titanium white just to make the value lighter. I'll start adding some of those lighter layers on top of the darker ones to give the suggestion of a 3-dimensional form within the pine tree's crown. I mix up a sky mix to punch holes within the canopy of the gum tree in the foreground, which just creates gaps and gives the illusion of clumps of leaves. And then I go over some of that foliage with some lighter layers, a mix of mainly ultramarine blue with yellow oxide and a little titanium white. Now as I work on the foliage in the foreground and the midground, so lots of those grasses and small plants there, with each pass I'm adding lighter layers of colour. For the grass in the foreground I've also increased the saturation of my green, and this is mostly a mix of ultramarine blue with yellow oxide. Then I mix in some cadmium yellow which increases the saturation, even a little phthalo green, and then I round off that colour with some Quinacridone magenta which adds a red element to the mix. It just earths that green. And of course I mix in some titanium white to make the value lighter. I paint some boats in the water just to add context to the scene. This is also going to help to make it more recognisable as the Bay of Islands. I mark in the hulls of these boats with a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and titanium white. I then paint the highlights of these boats, just marking in the suggestion of masts. I'm using a synthetic No. 0 round brush and then mixing a combination of titanium white with a little yellow oxide. I start marking in the suggestion of sparkles on the water where it's shimmering in the direct sunlight. Now when it comes to finishing up the painting, I save the final details and my lightest tones until the very end of the painting. I've mixed a variety of different greens here that are mainly tethered to a mix of ultramarine blue, yellow oxide and cadmium yellow. And again, using a synthetic No. 0 round brush, I paint the suggestion of leaves in those shrubs and trees in the midground. When it comes to painting that light coloured grass in the midground, I'm able to take my existing green mix and just add in more yellow oxide, titanium white and burnt sienna. And as I've been using these colours throughout most of the painting, it helps to make the colour more harmonious, as there's relationships between all the zones in the painting. I finish up the painting by adding a few highlights to the main stems on the pine tree, also the gum tree in the foreground. I also add a bit more heat into the reflected light on the main stem of the gum tree, and again this is the same colours that I used before, a mix of burnt sienna with yellow oxide, some titanium white and a small amount of ultramarine blue, but I make the value a little lighter than the previous layer. I really enjoyed painting this artwork, and I'm really enjoying just turning my plein air paintings into more detailed studio paintings. It's a really fun process and I definitely recommend you try it. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also feel free to leave me a comment as well. If you'd like to learn more about painting, then check out the painting resources I have on my website at samuelerp.com, where I've got a painting blog that's full of free written painting tutorials with reference photos as well, if you'd like to have a go at painting some of those. And then I also have some full-length painting tutorial videos which are for sale from my website. Now you can also get access to all of those full-length painting tutorial videos by subscribing to me on Patreon, where each month you'll get a new painting video. I've put all the links in the description below. And if you want to see what paintings I'm working on, you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and again I've put all the links in the description below. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I shall see you in the next one.